Ashenmere United. Seeking shelter from a deadly storm, Lady Beatrice of Blackmere stumbled upon the hidden stronghold of Sir Geoffrey de Moray, a knight long thought dead. He watched her from the shadows, his voice quiet as the wind howled outside. "You should not have come here, my lady," he murmured. "Now, I fear you never will leave." Chapter 1. The Howl of the North Wind. The wind was a ravenous beast, clawing at Lady Beatrice's cloak, tearing at the thick furs that did little to ward off the biting chill. Snow, driven by the gale, stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles, blurring the already fading light into a swirling, white abyss. Her horse, a normally stalwart mare named Willow, whinnied in protest, its hooves slipping on the treacherous, ice-slicked path. Beatrice leaned forward, whispering soothing words she barely believed herself, her fingers numb even within her thick gloves. "Easy, girl, easy. We'll find shelter soon. We must." But the words felt hollow, even to her own ears. They had been riding for hours, fleeing the treacherous roads that led back to Blackmere, her family's ancestral home. The news of her brother's sudden, violent death had reached her at the neighboring estate of Lord Ashworth, where she had been visiting. The official missive had spoken of a hunting accident, a boar's tusk ripping through chainmail and flesh with brutal efficiency. But the hurried, whispered warnings of the messenger, a loyal man-at-arms who had served her father for decades, spoke of something far more sinister.
Treachery. Poison.
A plot hatched within the very walls of Blackmere. "Flee, my lady," he had urged, his eyes wide with fear. "Flee while you still can. They will come for you next." And so she had fled, riding north into the teeth of a gathering storm, trusting instinct and a desperate hope that she could outrun the shadows that pursued her. Now, with the storm at its peak, that hope was dwindling. Blackmere was days behind her, lost in the blizzard. Ahead nothing but the howling wilderness and the growing certainty that she was utterly, hopelessly lost. Willow stumbled again, nearly throwing Beatrice from the saddle. The mare regained her footing, but stood trembling, her breath clouding the frigid air. Beatrice slid from the saddle, her legs stiff and aching, the cold seeping into her bones with a bone-deep intensity. She looked around, her heart sinking. The path, barely discernible even in daylight, had vanished completely beneath a blanket of snow. Towering pines, their branches heavy with snow, loomed like dark sentinels, their mournful creaks a chilling symphony. Despair, cold and sharp, began to grip her. She was alone, lost and freezing. The storm showed no sign of relenting. It was, she realized with a sickening lurch of her stomach, a death sentence. She closed her eyes, a single tear freezing on her cheek. A prayer, half-formed, escaped her lips, a plea to whatever gods might be listening in this desolate, frozen wasteland. Then, through the howling wind, she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. A clang, followed by another and another. Metal on metal. Distant, but unmistakable. Hope, fragile but insistent, flickered within her chest. She urged Willow forward, leading the exhausted mare by the reins, her steps slow and deliberate, each one a battle against the deepening snow. The sound grew louder, guiding her through the blinding white. Finally, through the swirling snow, she saw it. A faint, flickering light, emanating from what looked like a break in the trees. As she drew closer, the light resolved itself into a torch, burning brightly beside a massive, iron-bound gate. Beyond the gate, rising from the snow-covered ground like a slumbering giant, was a keep. Not the grand, sprawling castle of Blackmere, but a smaller, more formidable structure, built of dark, rough-hewn stone. It looked ancient, weathered, and abandoned. The walls were high and thick, topped with battlements that were partially obscured by the snow. No banners flew from its towers, no guards patrolled its walls. It was a silent, brooding presence in the heart of the storm. Beatrice hesitated. The keep offered shelter, certainly, but it also felt wrong, unnatural. A place out of time, forgotten by the world. But the cold was relentless, and Willow was near collapse. She had no choice. She approached the gate, her hand shaking as she reached for the heavy iron ring that served as a knocker. The metal was freezing cold, biting into her skin even through her glove. She hesitated again, a prickle of unease running down her spine. Then, with a surge of desperate courage, she lifted the ring and let it fall. The sound echoed through the stillness, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. Nothing. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She was about to turn away, to accept her fate, when she heard it. A slow, grinding sound. The gate, groaning in protest, began to swing inward, revealing a dark, yawning entrance. No one was visible. The gate seemed to open of its own accord. Beatrice, her heart pounding in her chest, took a tentative step forward. "Hello?" she called out, her voice thin and reedy in the wind. "Is anyone there?" Her words were met with silence. Only the howl of the wind and the creak of the ancient gate answer her. She glanced back at Willow, who stood shivering, her head drooping. Taking a deep breath, Beatrice stepped across the threshold, leading her mare into the unknown. The courtyard was covered in a thick layer of snow, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading towards the main keep. Large, heavy footprints, clearly made by someone wearing boots. She looked back at the gate. It was closing slowly, silently, sealing her inside. Panic flared in her chest, but she forced it down. She had to be strong. She had to survive. She followed the footprints, her senses on high alert, every shadow seeming to hold a hidden threat. The keep's main door was also ajar, revealing a dimly lit interior. She hesitated again, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. This was madness. She should turn back, face the storm, anything but enter this silent, ominous place. But the cold and the exhaustion and the faint, flickering hope that she might find warmth and shelter they were too strong to resist. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The entrance hall was vast and cold, the air thick with the scent of dust and damp stone. A single torch, mounted on the wall, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of melting snow. She took another step forward, her hand instinctively reaching for the small dagger she carried hidden beneath her cloak. It was a meager weapon, but it offered a small measure of comfort. "Hello?" she called out again, her voice echoing through the hall. "Is anyone here?" Silence. Then, a voice, quiet as the wind, yet carrying a strange, unsettling resonance, spoke from the shadows. "You should not have come here, my lady," it murmured. "Now, I fear you will never leave." Beatrice froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice had come from somewhere above her, in the darkness of the upper gallery. She slowly raised her head, her eyes straining to pierce the gloom. She could see nothing, only shadows. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Who is there?" The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Then, a figure slowly emerged from the shadows, descending a winding staircase with a measured, almost ghostly grace. He was tall, his form obscured by the dim light, but she could see the glint of metal, the hilt of a sword, perhaps, or the buckle of a belt. He moved with a quiet, contained power, a predator in his own domain. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, still shrouded in shadow, his face hidden. But she could feel his gaze, intense and unwavering, boring into her. It was a gaze that seemed to see through her, to strip away her defenses, to lay bare her fears and vulnerabilities. A shiver ran down her spine, a primal fear that had nothing to do with the cold. She was trapped in a silent, ancient keep, with a man who spoke of her never leaving. And in the depths of her heart, she knew he spoke the truth. The storm outside was a deadly threat, but the storm within these walls, that was something far more dangerous. Chapter 2. Sanctuary of Shadows. He stepped further into the torchlight, and Beatrice caught her breath. He was not what she expected. Not a monster, not a grizzled old warden, but a man who, despite the shadows that clung to him, possessed a striking, almost unsettling beauty. His face was lean and angular, framed by dark hair that fell to his shoulders, streaked with silver at the temples. His eyes, now clearly visible, were a piercing gray, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They held a depth of sadness, a weariness that seemed to weigh him down, yet they also held a spark of something else, a flicker of defiance, perhaps, or even hope. He was dressed in simple, dark clothing, a tunic of heavy wool, leather breeches, and high boots. No armor, no outward sign of nobility, yet there was an undeniable air of command about him, a quiet authority that spoke of a life lived on the edge of danger. He carried a sword at his side, its hilt worn smooth with age, the blade unseen within its scabbard. It was a warrior's weapon, not a nobleman's ornament.
Who are you?
Beatrice asked again, her voice steadier this time, though her heart still hammered against her ribs. She kept her hand near her dagger, a small, almost futile gesture of defiance. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. A ghost, some might say, he replied, his voice a low rumble, tinged with a hint of amusement. A forgotten relic of a bygone age. That is no answer, Beatrice retorted, her fear giving way to a flicker of anger. She was Lady of Blackmere, or at least she had been. She would not be cowed by riddles and shadows. This keep it is yours? He nodded slowly.
It is. Or rather it was.
And now it is my prison. Your prison? Beatrice frowned. But the gate was open. You could leave at any time. He smiled then, a fleeting, humorless expression that did not reach his eyes.
Could I?
The storm outside would disagree, my lady. And even if I were to brave the blizzard, where would I go? My name is cursed, my lands forfeit, my very existence a secret best left buried. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her travel-stained cloak, her exhausted mare, the fear that still lingered in her eyes. You are far from home, lady? Beatrice, she supplied, her pride warring with her apprehension. Lady Beatrice of Blackmere. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked. Blackmere? You are kin to Lord Alaric? The mention of her brother's name sent a fresh wave of grief and fear through her. He is dead, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Murdered. I was fleeing as she trailed off, unable to speak the rest, the fear of pursuit too raw, too immediate. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching, probing. Murdered, he repeated softly, the word hanging heavy in the air. And you believe you are in danger? Beatrice nodded, her throat tight. They will come for me. Whoever killed Alaric, they will want to silence me too. He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point, lost in thought. Then, he looked back at her, his expression hardening. Then you have chosen a poor sanctuary, my lady. This place offers little protection. It is haunted. Haunted? Beatrice scoffed, despite the shiver that ran down her spine. By what? Ghosts and goblins? He shook his head. By memories, my lady. By regrets.
By the ghosts of those I have failed.
He looked away, his voice dropping to a whisper. And by the very real threat of those who believe I should be dead. Beatrice stared at him, her mind reeling. This man, this ghost, he was clearly hiding something. Something dangerous. And yet there was a sincerity in his eyes, a vulnerability that belied his words. She felt a strange, unexpected tug of sympathy.
Who are you?
She asked again, her voice softer this time, stripped of its defiance.
Truly.
He hesitated, then took a deep breath. My name, he said, his voice low and measured, is Sir Geoffrey de Moray. And I was once known as the Lion of Blackwood, until the day my world fell apart. The name struck her like a physical blow. Sir Geoffrey de Moray, the Lion of Blackwood, a legendary knight, a hero of countless battles, a man spoken of in hushed whispers, a figure from her childhood tales. He had been betrothed to her aunt, Ilara, years ago. A love match, a rare thing in their world of arranged alliances. But Ilara had died, tragically, on the eve of their wedding. And Geoffrey de Moray, he had vanished. Presumed dead, lost in a battle against the northern rebels. That was 15 years ago. Beatrice stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the legend with the man standing before her. He looked older, certainly, wearied by time and hardship, but there was no mistaking the strong jaw, the piercing eyes, the aura of command that had made him a legend. "But you are said to be dead," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He gave a wry smile. "Rumors of my demise, as they say, have been greatly exaggerated. I survived the battle, though not unscathed. I retreated. From the world. From my duty. From everything."
Why?
Beatrice asked, the question burning in her mind. "Why would you abandon your name, your lands, your everything?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that was almost palpable. "Because I failed," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I failed Alara. I failed my men. I failed my king. And in failing them, I failed myself." He turned away, walking towards a large, empty fireplace that dominated one wall of the hall. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. Beatrice watched him, her heart aching for him, for the weight of his sorrow, for the burden of his past. She took a step towards him. "Sir Geoffrey," he held up a hand, stopping her. "Please, my lady."
Call me Geoffrey.
"The title, it means nothing to me now." Beatrice nodded. "Geoffrey," she repeated, the name feeling strange and unfamiliar on her tongue. "What happened?"
Tell me.
He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a haunted light. "It is a long story, my lady, and a painful one. Are you sure you wish to hear it?" Beatrice met his gaze, her own fears momentarily forgotten in the face of his suffering. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I am." He nodded slowly, then gestured towards a pair of worn, wooden chairs that sat near the fireplace. "Then let us sit, my lady, and I will tell you the tale of the Lion of Blackwood, and how he became the ghost of Blackwood Keep." And as the storm raged outside, and the shadows danced in the flickering torchlight, Geoffrey began to speak, his voice low and compelling, weaving a tale of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of a knight who had lost everything, and a lady who was about to lose even more. A story that intertwined their fates, even as both ran from the gathering storm. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Blackwood Keep. Geoffrey settled into one of the chairs, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He stared into the empty fireplace, as if seeing the flames of a long-dead fire, his gaze lost in the memories of a past that clearly haunted him. Beatrice sat opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her attention riveted on his face. Willow, after a hesitant look at Geoffrey, had settled down near the entrance, her breathing slow and even. "It began," Geoffrey said, his voice a low murmur, "with Alara. She was everything. My light, my hope, my reason for being. She was the daughter of Lord Ashworth, your neighbor, you may recall, and our betrothal was unusual. It was not arranged for political gain, for alliances or a land. It was love." He paused, a faint smile playing on his lips, a brief flicker of warmth in the otherwise bleak landscape of his face. "We met at a tournament years ago. I was a young knight, eager to prove myself, and she was radiant, like a sunbeam breaking through the clouds. I fell in love with her instantly, hopelessly, completely. And she, against all odds, returned my affections." Beatrice leaned forward, her heart aching for the young knight he had been, for the love he had known, for the loss he had suffered. She knew the story, of course, everyone in the region did. The tragic tale of the Lion of Blackwood and his lost love. But hearing it from his own lips, seeing the raw emotion in his eyes, gave it a new, devastating power. Her father, Lord Ashworth, was initially opposed to the match, Geoffrey continued. I was a second son, with no lands, no title of my own. But Alara was determined. She had a spirit as fiery as her hair, and she would not be swayed. Eventually, her father relented, seeing the depth of our love. We were betrothed, and the wedding was set for the following spring. He paused again, his voice catching in his throat. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if battling a wave of pain. Beatrice reached out instinctively to touch his hand, but stopped herself just short of making contact. She didn't want to break the spell, to interrupt the flow of his memories. "The months leading up to the wedding were the happiest of my life," Geoffrey said, his voice barely a whisper. "We spent every moment we could together, riding, hawking, walking in the gardens, talking for hours. We planned our future, our children, the life we would build together. It was a dream." He opened his eyes, and Beatrice saw the tears glistening there, unshed. "But dreams," he said, his voice bitter, "often turn to nightmares." "What happened?" Beatrice asked softly, her own eyes stinging with tears. "The Northern Rebellion," Geoffrey said, his voice hardening. "The Duke of Northumbria, a power-hungry, ruthless man, rose up against the king. I was called to arms, along with every other able-bodied knight in the realm. It was my duty, my sworn oath to the crown. I had to go." "And Ilara?" "She understood," Geoffrey said. "She was afraid, of course, but she was also proud. She knew I had to do my duty. She gave me a token, a scarf embroidered with her family crest, a white falcon on a field of blue. She told me to wear it, to keep me safe, to bring me back to her." He touched his chest, as if feeling the phantom weight of the scarf. "I rode to war with her love in my heart, and her promise on my lips. We would be married as soon as I returned. Victorious." He laughed, a harsh, self-deprecating sound. "Victory," he said, his voice dripping with irony. "It is a fickle mistress. I fought bravely, I led my men with courage, I won many battles. But in the end it was all for naught." "The battle where you disappeared," Beatrice said, her voice hesitant. Geoffrey nodded. "The Battle of Blackwood Moor. It was a bloody, brutal affair. The rebels outnumbered us, 2-1. They were better equipped, better prepared. But we fought on, driven by loyalty, by duty, by the hope of returning home." He closed his eyes again, his face contorted with pain. "I saw my friends fall, my comrades in arms, men I had known since boyhood. I saw the banner of my king trampled in the mud. I saw Ilara's scarf, torn and blood-stained, lying on the ground." He opened his eyes, and Beatrice gasped. They were filled with a raw, primal agony, the eyes of a man who had seen hell and lived to tell the tale. "I went mad," he said, his voice shaking. "I charged into the enemy ranks, seeking death, seeking oblivion. I killed I don't know how many, but it wasn't enough. I was surrounded, overwhelmed. A blow to the head, and then darkness." He fell silent, his body trembling. Beatrice waited, her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that the story was not yet over. "I awoke," Geoffrey said, his voice barely a whisper, days later, in a peasant's hut. An old woman, a healer, had found me, dragged me from the battlefield, tended to my wounds. She told me the battle was lost. The king was dead. The rebels were victorious. And I was a traitor." "A traitor?" Beatrice gasped. "But how?" "Someone had betrayed us," Geoffrey said, his voice filled with bitterness. "Someone had given the rebels our battle plans, our troop movements, our every secret. And that someone had implicated me. They had planted evidence, forged letters, spread rumors. I was accused of treason, of conspiring with the enemy, of causing the death of the king." "But that's impossible," Beatrice protested. "You were a hero, a loyal knight." Geoffrey shook his head. "Loyalty means nothing when weighed against ambition, greed, and lies, my lady. The new king, the Duke of Northumbria, believed the lies. He declared me an outlaw, a traitor to the realm. He stripped me of my name, my lands, my title. He put a price on my head, and he ordered my execution." "But Ilara," Beatrice said. Surely she didn't believe it. Geoffrey's face, if possible, turned even grayer. "Ilara never learned the truth and died believing I was everything they painted me to be. She fell ill, that much I do know, weakened and died of a broken heart on the day we were to wed. I learned of this from the old woman only weeks after I myself had recovered. She perished thinking I had died, both a traitor and a coward. I failed her above all others. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a despair that was almost unbearable. I was a dead man walking. I had nothing left. No name, no honor, no love. Only this keep. It was my mother's ancestral home, abandoned for years, forgotten by the world. I came here, seeking refuge, seeking oblivion. And here I have remained ever since, a ghost, haunting the ruins of my past. The wind howled even louder as he spoke, shaking the stone keep to its ancient foundations. The tale had ended, but Beatrice's fears had just been stoked to new heights. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Stone. The silence that followed Geoffrey's tale was heavy, broken only by the crackling of the torch on the wall and the distant moan of the wind. Beatrice sat, stunned, her mind reeling from the sheer weight of his story. The legendary Lion of Blackwood. A traitor? It seemed impossible, unbelievable. And yet, looking at him, at the pain etched on his face, the weariness in his eyes, she couldn't doubt the truth of his words. She felt a surge of not just sympathy, but empathy. She, too, was a fugitive, fleeing accusations, fearing for her life. She, too, had lost someone she loved, her brother, to treachery and deceit. Their circumstances were different, their pasts vastly dissimilar, but their present was remarkably alike. They were both trapped, by circumstance, by fate, by the shadows of their past. I don't know what to say, Beatrice finally said, her voice hushed. It's a terrible story. Unjust. Unfair. Geoffrey gave a wry, humorless smile. Life rarely is fair, my lady, especially in these times. But thank you for listening. It has been a long time since I have spoken of these things to anyone. But why tell me? Beatrice asked. Why reveal your secret to a stranger, a potential enemy? He looked at her, his gray eyes searching, probing. Because, he said slowly, I see something in you, Lady Beatrice. Something familiar. A kindred spirit, perhaps. A fellow traveler on a dark and dangerous road. He paused, then added, and because I believe you are in danger. Real danger. And perhaps, just perhaps, we can help each other. Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. His words echoed her own thoughts, her own desperate hope. Help each other? She repeated.
How?
You said you were fleeing, Geoffrey said. That whoever killed your brother would come for you. You believe it was treachery, poison, a plot. Beatrice nodded, her throat tight.
Yes.
The messenger, he warned me. He said it was someone close to Alaric. Someone within our own household. Geoffrey's eyes narrowed. Do you have any suspicions? Any enemies who might have benefited from your brother's death? Beatrice hesitated. She had her suspicions, of course, dark, unspoken fears that she had tried to push aside. But to voice them, to give them form and substance, it felt like a betrayal in itself. There is Lord Caradoc, she said finally, her voice low. My brother's advisor. He was always ambitious, always seeking more power. And he disliked me. He saw me as an obstacle. An obstacle? Geoffrey raised an eyebrow. Alaric was unmarried, Beatrice explained. He had no heir. By law, Blackmere would pass to me, upon his death. And Caradoc, he wanted Blackmere. He wanted the power, the influence, the wealth. He had proposed an alliance. A marriage. And you refused? Beatrice nodded. I despised him. He was cruel, ruthless. I would never have married him. And Alaric, he knew it. He would never have forced me. Geoffrey was silent for a moment, considering her words. This Lord Caradoc, he said. He is at Blackmere now. Yes, Beatrice said. He took control immediately. He declared himself regent. Until a new heir is found. Or until he can consolidate his power, Geoffrey said, his voice grim. And eliminate any potential threats. Such as yourself. Beatrice shivered. His words were blunt, brutal, but they echoed her own fears.
So, what do we do?
She asked, her voice trembling. Geoffrey stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked over to the window, looking out at the swirling snow. We stay here, he said.
For now.
The storm will provide cover. No one will be able to track you through this. But for how long? Beatrice asked. We can't stay here forever. He turned back to her, his face set. We will stay until we have a plan, he said. A plan to expose Caradoc, to clear your name, and perhaps to clear my own. Clear your name? Beatrice repeated, her eyes widening. But how is that possible? After all these years? Geoffrey smiled, a fleeting, determined expression. The truth, he said, has a way of revealing itself, eventually. It may be buried, hidden, distorted, but it never truly disappears. And I believe there are still those who remember, who know the truth. We just need to find them. He paused, then added, and we need evidence. Proof of Caradoc's treachery. Proof of my innocence. It will not be easy. It will be dangerous. But I am willing to risk it. Are you? Beatrice looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. His offer was reckless. Insane, even. To challenge a powerful lord, to uncover a conspiracy that had spanned years, it was a fool's errand. And yet, she felt a surge of hope, a flicker of defiance, a refusal to accept her fate. She had nothing left to lose. Her brother was dead, her home was in the hands of her enemy, her life was in danger. She could either surrender, accept her fate, or she could fight. And in that moment, looking into the eyes of the man who had once been the Lion of Blackwood, she knew she could not surrender. Yes, she said, her voice firm, resolute. I am. Geoffrey nodded, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in his eyes. Then we have a pact, Lady Beatrice. A pact forged in the shadows, sealed by the storm. We will fight together. For justice. For truth. For redemption. He extended his hand, and Beatrice, without hesitation, took it. His grip was strong, firm, reassuring. A sense of connection, of shared purpose, flowed between them. A bond forged in the face of adversity, a promise of a future that was uncertain, but no longer hopeless. As the snow fell outside, and the wind howled around the ancient keep, a new alliance was born. An alliance between a fugitive lady and a ghost of a knight, a desperate gamble to reclaim their lives, their names, and their futures. Beatrice, looking at him, had one more doubt. But what of the rumors of this place? You yourself spoke of hauntings and danger within. Geoffrey gave a tired smile. Those are just old wives' tales to keep local villagers away. It is safe enough. Within. The danger is all outside, my lady, and that we will face together. But as he said the word together, a faint whisper echoed in the stone behind Beatrice. She shivered, though not from the cold. Chapter 5. The Price of Shelter. The whisper, faint as it was, sent a chill down Beatrice's spine. She glanced around the hall, her eyes searching the shadows, but saw nothing. The torchlight flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist, playing tricks on her eyes. She dismissed it as a product of her overactive imagination, fueled by Geoffrey's story and the unsettling atmosphere of the keep. We should see to Willow, she said, her voice slightly shaky. She must be exhausted and freezing. Geoffrey nodded. Of course. There's a stable of sorts at the back of the courtyard. It's rudimentary, but it will offer some shelter from the storm. He led the way, his steps silent on the stone floor, his presence a reassuring counterpoint to the unsettling whispers of the keep. Beatrice followed close behind, her hand on the hilt of her dagger, her senses on high alert. The stable, when they reached it, was indeed rudimentary. A simple, stone structure, with a partially collapsed roof and several empty stalls. It was cold and damp, but it was out of the wind, and there was a small amount of dry straw scattered on the floor. Willow, upon seeing Beatrice, whinnied softly and nuzzled her shoulder. Beatrice stroked the mare's neck, whispering soothing words, feeling a surge of gratitude for the animal's companionship. Geoffrey, meanwhile, was inspecting the stable, checking for any signs of what?
Danger?
Intrusion? Beatrice wasn't sure. It's not much, he said, his voice apologetic. But it will have to do. I haven't used it in years. It's fine, Beatrice said, trying to sound reassuring. Willow will be grateful for any shelter. They worked together, silently, to make the stable as comfortable as possible for the mare. Geoffrey found a bucket and filled it with water from a nearby well, while Beatrice gathered more straw and spread it in one of the stalls. They worked with a quiet efficiency, a sense of shared purpose that was oddly comforting. Once Willow was settled and seemed reasonably content, Geoffrey turned to Beatrice. "You must be tired and hungry," he said. "I can offer you some food. And a room. It's not luxurious, but it's clean." Beatrice hesitated. She was tired and hungry, and the thought of a warm meal and a bed, however humble, was incredibly appealing. But she was also acutely aware of her vulnerability. She was alone, in a remote keep, with a man she barely knew, a man who, despite his kindness, was still a stranger, and a self-confessed outcast. Geoffrey seemed to sense her hesitation. "You have nothing to fear from me, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice gentle. "I gave you my word. I will not harm you. I will protect you." His words were reassuring, but Beatrice still felt a prickle of unease. She looked into his eyes, trying to gauge his sincerity, to see any hint of deception, but found only weariness and a strange, almost desperate honesty. "I trust you," she said finally, the words feeling both true and foolish at the same time. She had to trust him. She had no other choice. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Thank you, my lady. That means more to me than you know." He led her back into the keep, through a maze of corridors and rooms, each one colder and more desolate than the last. The keep was clearly in a state of disrepair, neglected for years, the dust of ages thick on every surface. Tapestries hung in tatters, furniture was broken and overturned, and a sense of decay, of lost grandeur, permeated the air. Finally, they reached a small chamber, tucked away at the end of a long corridor. It was sparsely furnished, with only a narrow bed, a rickety table, and a single chair. A small window, covered in a thick layer of frost, offered a glimpse of the swirling snow outside. But it was clean, relatively speaking, and a small fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow. "This was my mother's room," Geoffrey said, his voice soft. "It's the only one I've kept habitable." Beatrice looked around, her eyes taking in the details. A faded tapestry on the wall, depicting a falcon in flight. A small, wooden chest, tucked beneath the window. A single, dried flower, lying on the table. It was a room filled with memories, with echoes of a life lived, a life lost. "It's perfect," she said, her voice sincere. "Thank you." Geoffrey nodded. "I'll bring you some food," he said, "and then I'll leave you to rest." He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Beatrice stood for a moment, listening to his retreating footsteps, feeling a strange mixture of relief and loneliness. She was safe, for now, sheltered from the storm, but she was also alone, in a strange, unsettling place, surrounded by the ghosts of Geoffrey's past. She walked over to the fire, warming her hands, her gaze drawn to the tapestry on the wall. The falcon, soaring through the sky, a symbol of freedom, of hope. It reminded her of Alara's token, the scarf that Geoffrey had carried into battle. A symbol of love, of loyalty, of a promise broken. She touched the tapestry, her fingers tracing the outline of the falcon, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of sadness. For Alara, for Geoffrey, for herself. For all the lost loves, the broken promises, the shattered dreams that haunted this ancient keep. She heard a knock on the door, and turned, her heart skipping a beat. Geoffrey entered, carrying a tray laden with food. A simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat, but it smelled delicious, and Beatrice realized how hungry she was. "Thank you," she said, as he placed the tray on the table.
"Eat," he said.
"You need to regain your strength." He stood by the fire, watching her as she ate, his presence a silent, watchful presence. Beatrice ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling the warmth of the food spreading through her body. As she ate, She couldn't help but steal glances at Geoffrey, studying his face, his movements, trying to understand the man behind the legend, the ghost behind the night. He was an enigma, a paradox, a man of contradictions. A warrior and a recluse, a hero and a traitor, a protector and a prisoner. "What will you do?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. "While I rest." He shrugged. "I have tasks," he said vaguely. "Things to attend to."
Don't worry about me.
"But you said this place was haunted," Beatrice said, her voice hesitant. "Are you safe?" He smiled, a fleeting, humorless expression. "I am used to ghosts, my lady. They are my constant companions." He paused, then added, "But thank you for your concern. And what of supplies? You say you have lived here alone. For years."
How?
He cut her off with a hand gesture. "I have ways. The forest provides.
And
Occasionally I venture out, under cover of darkness, to a nearby village.
they
Do not ask questions." He finished with a look, conveying he didn't want to explain any further. He turned to leave. "Rest now, Lady Beatrice. We have a long road ahead of us." As he reached the door, Beatrice, suddenly nervous, spoke. "Geoffrey, will they hear us? The whispers?" He turned back, a dark, almost sad smile playing on his features. "They always hear, my lady. Always." Chapter 6. A Knight's Confession. Geoffrey's words hung in the air, sending another shiver down Beatrice's spine. "They always hear." She looked around the small chamber, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, half expecting to see something. Someone. But there was nothing. Only the crackling fire, the faded tapestry, and the faint, unsettling whisper of the wind outside. She finished the last of the food, her appetite diminished by a growing unease. She stood up, walking over to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. The storm showed no sign of relenting. It was as if the keep and its inhabitants were trapped in a world of perpetual winter. She turned back to the room, her gaze falling on the small, wooden chest tucked beneath the window. It was a simple chest, unadorned, but it seemed to draw her attention, to hold a secret, a whisper of its own. She hesitated, then, driven by a curiosity she couldn't explain, she knelt down and opened the chest. It was unlocked. Inside, she found a collection of objects. Mementos, perhaps. Remnants of a life lived, a life lost. There was a small, silver locket, intricately carved with the image of a falcon. She opened it and found a miniature portrait of a beautiful woman, with fiery red hair and laughing green eyes. Alara. She recognized her from Geoffrey's description. There was a faded, silk scarf, embroidered with the same falcon crest. Alara's token, the one Geoffrey had carried into battle. The one he had lost. She touched it gently, feeling the smooth, worn fabric beneath her fingers, imagining the love and hope that had been woven into its threads. There was a collection of letters, tied together with a ribbon. She hesitated, feeling a sense of intrusion. These were private letters, intimate correspondence. But her curiosity, her need to understand Geoffrey, to understand the tragedy that had shaped his life, overwhelmed her. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. It was dated 15 years ago, shortly before the Battle of Blackwood Moor. The handwriting was Geoffrey's. Strong, bold, yet with a certain elegance. "My dearest Alara," the letter began. "The days grow short, and the shadows lengthen. Soon, I must ride to war, to defend our king, our realm, our future. But my heart remains with you, always. Every beat echoes your name. Every breath whispers your promise. I wear your token close to my heart, a shield against all harm, a beacon to guide me home." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears as she read the words, feeling the depth of Geoffrey's love for Alara, the pain of their separation, the fear that must have haunted them both. She continued reading, each letter a testament to their love, their devotion, their unwavering hope for a future together. The last letter, however, was different. It was written in a hurried, frantic scrawl, the words barely legible. Alara, my love, I fear the worst. There is treachery afoot. Betrayal. I do not know who to trust. I may not return. But know this, my love. I love you, more than life itself. And if I die with your name on my lips. Beatrice's hand trembled as she folded the letter, her heart aching for Geoffrey, for the fear and despair he must have felt in his final moments before the battle. She placed the letters back in the chest, her mind reeling from the weight of their contents. She closed the chest, feeling a sudden, overwhelming need to talk to Geoffrey, to understand the full extent of his tragedy, to offer him comfort, solace, anything. She left the room, her steps hurried, her heart pounding in her chest. She found him in the great hall, standing by the fireplace, staring into the empty grate. He was different. He seemed diminished, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed, his entire demeanor radiating a profound sense of grief. "Geoffrey?" she said softly, her voice hesitant. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to notice her presence. He was lost, it seemed, in the depths of his own memories, his own pain. Beatrice took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Geoffrey," she said again, her voice louder this time. He started, turning to her, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked at her for a moment, as if not recognizing her, as if seeing a ghost. "Alara?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Beatrice's heart sank. He was reliving it. The loss, the betrayal, the pain. It was as if the keep itself was forcing him to confront his past, to relive his darkest moments. "Geoffrey," she said, her voice firm, "it's me, Beatrice." He blinked, his eyes slowly focusing, his awareness returning. He looked at her, his expression shifting from confusion to embarrassment, to shame. "My lady," he said, his voice hoarse.
Apologisa?
"I was lost in thought. I found the chest," Beatrice said, her voice hesitant. "In your mother's room. I read the letters." His eyes widened, and he took a step back, as if struck. "You read them?" he repeated, his voice filled with pain. Anger? She couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," Beatrice said. "I shouldn't have. It was an intrusion. But I needed to understand. To understand you. To understand what happened." He turned away, his back to her, his shoulders shaking. He stood there for a long moment, silent, struggling to regain his composure. Beatrice waited, her heart aching for him, feeling a profound sense of connection, of shared grief. Finally, he turned back to her, his face pale, his eyes filled with a raw, naked vulnerability that she had never seen before. "It was a mistake," he said, his voice low and strained. "To come here. To open those wounds. I thought I had buried them. That I had moved on. But I was wrong." "It's all right," Beatrice said, her voice soothing. "It's all right to grieve. To remember. To feel." He shook his head. "No," he said. "It's not all right. It's weakness. A knight, a warrior, should not be weak." "It's not weakness," Beatrice said, her voice firm. "It's humanity. It's what makes us human. To love, to lose, to grieve, it's all part of life." He looked at her, his eyes searching, probing, as if seeking something. Solace? Understanding? Forgiveness? I failed her," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I failed Alara. I promised her I would return. And I didn't. I left her to die alone, believing I was a traitor." "You didn't fail her," Beatrice said, her voice gentle. "You were betrayed. You were a victim, just like she was." He shook his head again, his eyes filled with tears. "No," he said. I should have done something. Found a way. Saved her. Saved myself." "You couldn't have known," Beatrice said. "You couldn't have prevented it. It was fate. It was treachery. It was beyond your control." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading expression. Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Beatrice met his gaze, her own eyes filled with compassion, with empathy, with a growing sense of something more. Something deeper. Something dangerous. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "I do. And as she held his tortured gaze, she knew this was more than an alliance. It was a joining of souls, forged not just by danger, but the crushing weight of shared heartbreak. Chapter 7. The Serpent in the Garden. The intensity of the moment between them lingered, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was forming, fragile yet undeniably present. Geoffrey was the first to break the gaze, turning away slightly, as if embarrassed by the vulnerability he had revealed. "We should focus on the present," he said, his voice regaining some of its former strength, though still tinged with a hint of tremor. "On Caradoc. On your situation." Beatrice nodded, her heart still pounding from the raw emotion of their exchange. She, too, needed to focus, to regain her composure, to remember the danger that still loomed over her. "You're right," she said. "We need a plan. But how can we possibly challenge Caradoc? He has the entire force of Blackmere at his command. He has the law on his side." Geoffrey paced slowly back and forth in front of the fireplace, his brow furrowed in thought. "The law," he said, his voice laced with bitterness, "is a malleable thing, my lady. It can be twisted, manipulated, used to serve the interests of those in power. We need something more than the law. We need leverage." "Leverage?" Beatrice repeated. "What kind of leverage?" "Information," Geoffrey said. "Proof of Caradoc's treachery. Something concrete. Something that cannot be denied, or dismissed as rumor." "But where would we find such proof?" Beatrice asked, her voice filled with doubt. "Caradoc is careful. Cunning. He would not leave evidence lying around." Geoffrey stopped pacing, his gaze fixed on Beatrice. "Perhaps not," he said. "But he may have overlooked something. Someone. A witness. A confidant. Someone who knows the truth, but is afraid to speak." He paused, then added, "Or perhaps there is something at Blackmere itself. A hidden message. A secret document. Something that Alaric left behind." Beatrice's mind raced. She tried to think of anyone at Blackmere who might have known of Caradoc's plot, anyone who might have been close to Alaric, anyone who might be willing to betray Caradoc. But her mind drew a blank. Everyone she could think of was either loyal to Caradoc, or too afraid to oppose him. I don't know," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "I can't think of anyone. Caradoc has purged the household of anyone who might be disloyal. He has spies everywhere. He controls everything." Geoffrey nodded, his expression grim. "It will not be easy," he said. "But we must try. We must investigate. We must find something." He paused, then looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a determination that sent a shiver down her spine. "I will go to Blackmere," he said. Beatrice's eyes widened in shock. "You?" she exclaimed. "But that's madness. You're an outlaw. A declared traitor. If you're caught, you'll be executed." Geoffrey smiled, a fleeting, reckless expression. "I am already a dead man, my lady," he said. "What have I to lose?" "But it's too dangerous," Beatrice protested. "There must be another way." Geoffrey shook his head. "There is no other way," he said. "I know Blackmere. I know its secrets, its hidden passages, its weaknesses. I can infiltrate the castle. I can find the proof we need." "But how?" Beatrice asked. "Caradoc will have guards everywhere. He will be expecting you. He will be expecting the Lion of Blackwood," Geoffrey said, his voice low and intense. "A legendary knight, a formidable warrior. He will not be expecting a ghost, a shadow, a nobody." He paused, then added, "I have skills, learned over the years. Skills of disguise, of deception. I can blend in. I can become invisible. I can move through the castle unseen, unheard." Beatrice stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the audacity of his plan. It was reckless, insane, suicidal. And yet there was a certain logic to it. A desperate, last resort kind of logic. She looked into his eyes, seeing the determination, the desperation, the unwavering resolve. She knew he was serious. He was willing to risk everything, to face his past, to confront his demons, to help her. "I don't want you to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's too dangerous. I can't let you." He reached out, taking her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "You are not letting me, my lady," he said, his voice gentle. "I am choosing to do this. For you. For myself. For justice." He paused, then added, "and perhaps for Alara. To finally clear my name. To avenge her death. To find peace." Beatrice looked at him, her heart aching for him, for the burden he carried, for the pain he had endured. She knew she couldn't stop him. He was determined. And she trusted him.
When?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper.
Tonight, he said.
Under cover of darkness.
The storm will be my ally.
He released her hand and turned away, walking towards a small, wooden chest that stood in the corner of the hall. He opened it and began to remove its contents. Beatrice watched him, her mind filled with a mixture of fear, admiration, and a growing sense of something more. Something that she couldn't quite define, couldn't quite name. As he prepared for his perilous journey, Beatrice felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The whispers seemed louder now, closer, as if the very stones of the keep were warning her of the danger to come. She moved closer to the fire, seeking its warmth, but finding only cold comfort. The serpent had been identified, but could it truly be defeated? Chapter 8. Scars of the Past. Geoffrey worked with a quiet, focused intensity, transforming himself before Beatrice's eyes. He removed his simple tunic and breeches, revealing a lean, muscular physique, scarred with the marks of countless battles. Old wounds, faded but still visible, crisscrossed his back and chest, a testament to a life lived on the edge of danger. Beatrice watched him, her gaze drawn to the scars, each one a story, a memory, a reminder of the pain he had endured. She felt a strange mixture of fascination, awe, and a deep, unsettling empathy. He donned a different set of clothing, darker, more nondescript, clothes that would allow him to blend into the shadows, to become invisible. He wrapped a length of dark cloth around his head, obscuring his hair, his features, leaving only his eyes visible. He strapped a sheathed dagger to his thigh and a small pouch, filled with what? Tools? Poisons? Beatrice wasn't sure. He looked at her, his eyes, now the only visible feature of his face, holding a strange intensity. "I will be someone else," he said, his voice muffled by the cloth. "A servant. A stable hand. A nobody. Someone Caradoc will not notice." "But what if you're recognized?" Beatrice asked, her voice filled with concern. "What if someone remembers you?"
He shook his head.
15 years is a long time, my lady," he said. "Memories fade. Faces change. And I have learned to control my appearance. My demeanor. I can become anyone." He paused, then added, "But if I am recognized, if I am caught, I will not betray you. I will not reveal your presence here." "Don't talk like that," Beatrice said, her voice sharp. "You will not be caught. You will succeed. You will return." He smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible expression behind the cloth. "Hope," he said, "is a dangerous thing, my lady, but I will cling to it. For you." He turned away, gathering a few more items, a small coil of rope, a handful of dried meat, a waterskin. He was ready. Beatrice felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to stop him, to beg him not to go, to protect him. But she knew she couldn't. He was determined, and she had to let him go. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "Please be careful." He nodded. "I will," he said. "And you stay here.
Stay hidden.
Do not venture out. Do not trust anyone." He paused, then added, "I will return as soon as I can, with whatever I can find." He turned and walked towards the door, his movements silent, his form already fading into the shadows. He was a ghost, a phantom, disappearing into the night. Beatrice watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind filled with a mixture of fear, dread, and a strange, unsettling hope. She was alone, again, in the silence of the keep, surrounded by the whispers of the past. She walked over to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. The storm had abated slightly, the wind no longer howling with the same ferocity, but the snow was still falling, thick and heavy, obscuring the world outside. She saw him, For a moment, a fleeting shadow moving through the snow, disappearing into the darkness. And then he was gone. She stood there for a long time, staring out at the empty landscape, feeling a profound sense of loneliness, of vulnerability. She was alone, with nothing but her fears, her doubts, and the faint, flickering hope that Geoffrey would return. She turned away from the window, walking back towards the fireplace, her gaze drawn to the scars on his discarded clothing, imagining the battles he had fought, the pain he had endured, the love he had lost. She was still dwelling on these moments when a floorboard creaked behind her. She jumped, her hand flying to her dagger. She whipped around, her eyes searching the shadows. Nothing. She stood, frozen, listening intently, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire. She slowly lowered her dagger, her breathing returning to normal. It was nothing. Her imagination. Her fear. She tried to calm herself, to reassure herself, to believe that Geoffrey was right, that the whispers were just old wives' tales. But as she turned back towards the fire, she saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. A shadow, shifting, moving. She stared, her eyes widening in terror, her blood turning to ice. It was something, someone, hidden in the darkness, watching her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed, frozen with fear. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and she saw it. A faint, glimmering light, reflecting off metal. A blade. She gasped, finally finding her voice, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The figure lunged, swift and silent, the blade raised, ready to strike. Beatrice reacted instinctively, throwing herself to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly thrust. She scrambled to her feet, her dagger drawn, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who was this? An agent of Caradoc? Or something else? Before she could speak or even think, a raspy voice, heavy with age, filled the room.
So,
the lion leaves his cub unguarded. A fatal mistake. Chapter 9. The Dance of Deception. The voice, raspy and filled with malice, sent a fresh wave of terror through Beatrice. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the figure emerging from the shadows. It was an old woman, stooped and frail, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes glittering with a strange, unsettling light. She was dressed in rags, her gray hair hanging in tangled strands, and she clutched a wickedly sharp dagger in her gnarled hand.
Who are you?
Beatrice stammered, her voice trembling, her grip tightening on her own dagger. The old woman cackled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the hall.
Who am I?
She repeated, her voice mocking. I am the keeper of secrets, the guardian of the past, the voice of the whispers. The whispers? Beatrice repeated, her mind reeling. You're the one who hears, the old woman interrupted, her eyes narrowing. The one who sees. The one who knows. Knows what? Beatrice asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do you know? The old woman took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I know everything, she said, her voice low and menacing. I know your secrets, Lady Beatrice. I know your fears. I know your destiny. My destiny? Beatrice repeated, her heart pounding in her chest. What do you mean? The old woman smiled, a cruel, twisted expression that revealed yellowed, decaying teeth. Your destiny, she said, is to die. Just like your brother. Just like the lion. The lion? Beatrice gasped. Geoffrey? You know him? The old woman cackled again. Know him? She repeated. I raised him. I taught him. I made him what he was. Beatrice stared at her, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of her words. This old woman, she was connected to Geoffrey? To his past? To the whispers? You're lying, Beatrice said, her voice shaking. You're mad. The old woman shook her head, her eyes glittering with a strange, unsettling intensity. I am not mad, my lady, she said. I am the truth. The truth that Geoffrey has tried to bury. The truth that he cannot escape. What truth? Beatrice demanded, her voice rising.
Tell me.
What truth? The old woman took another step closer, her dagger glinting in the torchlight. The truth, she said, is that Geoffrey is not who he seems. He is not a hero. He is not a victim. He is a monster.
A monster?
Beatrice repeated, her voice filled with disbelief.
No.
That's a lie. Geoffrey is good. He's kind. He's a deceiver, the old woman interrupted, her voice sharp. A manipulator. A killer.
A killer?
Beatrice gasped. You're saying Geoffrey killed Alara? The old woman smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent a chill down Beatrice's spine. Not directly, my lady, she said. But he is responsible. His actions, his betrayal, his weakness led to her death. Just as they will lead to yours. No, Beatrice whispered, her voice shaking. I don't believe you. The old woman shrugged. Believe what you will, my lady, she said. It matters not. Your fate is sealed, just as his was. She lunged again, her dagger flashing, aiming for Beatrice's heart. Beatrice reacted instinctively, parrying the blow with her own dagger, the two blades clashing with a sharp, metallic clang. The old woman was surprisingly strong, for her age, her frail appearance deceiving. She pressed her attack, forcing Beatrice to back away, to defend herself against a flurry of blows. Beatrice fought back, her fear giving way to a surge of adrenaline, of desperation. She was not a trained warrior, like Geoffrey, but she was resourceful. She was determined.
She would not die.
Not like this. Not at the hands of this madwoman. They danced around the hall, their blades clashing, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, the shadows twisting and writhing around them, as if participating in the deadly dance. Beatrice managed to land a blow, her dagger slicing across the old woman's arm, drawing blood. The old woman hissed in pain, but did not falter. She pressed her attack, even more ferociously, her eyes filled with a burning hatred. You cannot win, my lady, she hissed. You are doomed. Just like him. Beatrice felt a surge of anger. Anger at the old woman, at her lies, at her malice. Anger at the situation, at the danger, at the injustice of it all. I am not doomed, Beatrice retorted, her voice firm, resolute. And neither is Geoffrey. We will survive. We will fight. We will win. She lunged, her dagger aimed for the old woman's heart, a desperate, reckless attack. But the old woman was too quick. She sidestepped the blow, and with a swift, brutal movement, she disarmed Beatrice, sending her dagger clattering across the stone floor. Beatrice stood, defenseless, her back against the wall, the old woman's dagger pointed at her throat. She was trapped, defeated. The old woman smiled, a triumphant, cruel smile. It is over, my lady, she said. Your time has come. Just as the crone was about to strike the final blow, a voice called from the shadows. Morwen. Enough. Beatrice and the crone Morwen froze. A third figure had quietly entered the fray. Chapter 10. Beneath a Frozen Moon. The voice, though quiet, carried a weight of authority that cut through the tension in the hall. Morwen, her dagger still poised at Beatrice's throat, slowly turned her head, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the shadows. Beatrice, her heart pounding in her chest, followed her gaze, her eyes straining to see who had spoken. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the flickering torchlight. It was a man, tall and lean, his face obscured by a deep cowl, his form shrouded in a dark cloak. He moved with a quiet grace, a sense of familiarity that sent a jolt of recognition through Beatrice. Geoffrey? She whispered, her voice barely audible, filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The figure stopped, his head tilted slightly, as if considering her question. Then he slowly lowered his cowl, revealing his face. It was Geoffrey, but different. His eyes, normally filled with a weary sadness, now held a cold, steely glint. His expression, normally gentle and compassionate, was now hard, resolute, almost menacing. Geoffrey? Beatrice repeated, her voice shaking, her mind struggling to reconcile the man she knew with the stranger standing before her. Yes, my lady, he said, his voice low and even, devoid of any warmth.
It is I.
Morwen, her eyes still fixed on Geoffrey, slowly lowered her dagger, her expression shifting from triumph to confusion, to fear. My lord? She said, her voice trembling. You have returned? Geoffrey nodded. I have, he said. And I see you have been entertaining our guest. She knows, Morwen said, her voice hesitant. She has seen the letters. She knows nothing, Geoffrey interrupted, his voice sharp. She is an outsider. A pawn. She is insignificant. Beatrice stared at him, her heart sinking, her mind reeling from his words. A pawn? Insignificant? Was this the same man who had held her hand, who had shared his pain, who had promised to protect her? But my lord, Morwen said, her voice pleading. She is dangerous. She is a threat. She is no threat to me, Geoffrey said, his voice cold and dismissive. I will deal with her. In my own way. He turned to Beatrice, his eyes, now devoid of any warmth, boring into her. You have been meddling, my lady, he said, exploring secrets that were best left buried, asking questions that were best left unanswered. I was trying to understand, Beatrice stammered, her voice trembling. I was trying to help you. He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Help me? He repeated, his voice mocking. You cannot help me, my lady. No one can. I am beyond help. But you said, Beatrice began, her voice choked with emotion. You said we were allies, that we would fight together. Allies? He repeated, his voice dripping with irony. A foolish notion. A convenient lie. I used you, my lady, just as I used everyone. Used me? Beatrice repeated, her voice barely a whisper.
How? To gain access to Blackmere, he said.
To distract Caradoc. To create chaos. To further my own plans. Your plans? Beatrice asked, her voice filled with betrayal, with heartbreak. What plans? He smiled, a slow, cruel smile that revealed a darkness she had never seen before. My plans, he said, are to reclaim what is rightfully mine. My title, my lands, my power, and to avenge myself on those who have wronged me. But you said you were innocent, Beatrice protested, her voice shaking. You said you were framed. He laughed again, a chilling sound that echoed through the hall. Innocent? He repeated. There is no such thing as innocence, my lady. Only power. And weakness. And I am not weak. So you did betray the king? Beatrice asked, her voice barely a whisper, tears streaming down her face. You did cause Alara's death? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating light. Alara, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, was a means to an end. A stepping stone. She served her purpose. And then she was discarded. Beatrice gasped, her heart shattering into a million pieces. The man she had trusted, the man she had cared for, the man she had begun to love, was a monster. A liar. A murderer. You're evil, she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. He shrugged.
Perhaps, he said.
But I am alive. And I am in control. And that, my lady, is all that matters. He turned to Morwen.
Take her, he said.
Lock her away. In the deepest dungeon. Let her rot. Morwen, her eyes still filled with a mixture of fear and confusion, nodded and approached Beatrice, her dagger still in her hand. Beatrice looked at Geoffrey, her eyes filled with despair, with hatred, with a profound sense of loss. I hate you, she said, her voice trembling. I will never forgive you. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a final, devastating shiver down her spine. Forgiveness, he said, is for the weak, my lady.
And you're weak.
As Morwen dragged her away, Beatrice's last glimpse of Geoffrey was of him standing by the fireplace, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight, his eyes gleaming with a cold, triumphant light. The lion had returned, not as a savior, but as a predator. And she, his prey, was now trapped in his lair, beneath a frozen, uncaring moon. The whispers, she realized with chilling certainty, had been right all along. Chapter 11. The Weight of a Crown. The dungeon was cold, damp, and dark. The only light came from a single, narrow slit in the wall, high above, barely illuminating the rough-hewn stone floor and the thick, iron bars that separated Beatrice from the rest of the keep. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the silence was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water and the occasional scuttling of rats. Beatrice sat huddled in a corner, wrapped in her cloak, trying to ward off the bone-chilling cold. She was numb. Numb with shock, with betrayal, with despair. The events of the past few hours had shattered her world, her beliefs, her everything. Geoffrey a monster. A liar. A murderer. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved had used her, manipulated her, betrayed her. It was unbelievable. Unthinkable. And yet she had seen it with her own eyes, heard it with her own ears. There was no denying the truth. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the images, the words, the pain. But it was no use. They haunted her, tormented her, echoing through the darkness of the dungeon. She remembered his kindness, his gentleness, his vulnerability, the stories he had shared, the pain he had revealed, the connection she had felt. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed facade, designed to deceive, to manipulate, to use her. She felt foolish, naive, gullible. How could she have been so blind, so trusting? She had fallen for his charm, his charisma, his carefully crafted persona. She had allowed herself to love him. And now she was paying the price. Trapped in a dungeon, at the mercy of a madman, her life forfeit. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, not just from the cold, but from the fear. Fear of what Geoffrey would do, fear of what the future held, fear of dying alone, in the darkness. She thought of her brother, Alaric, murdered by Caradoc, his death avenged, in a way, by Geoffrey's actions. But it was a hollow victory. A victory tainted by betrayal, by deceit, by evil. She thought of Blackmere, her home, now in the hands of a tyrant who would rule with an iron fist, crushing any opposition, silencing any dissent. She thought of escape. But there was no escape. The dungeon was impenetrable. The bars were thick and strong. The door was locked and guarded. She was trapped. She closed her eyes again, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. She was alone, abandoned, forgotten. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her grief, her despair, her hopelessness. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The darkness enveloped her, consumed her, becoming a part of her. Then she heard it, a faint sound, barely audible above the drip, drip, drip of water. A scraping sound, a scratching sound. She opened her eyes, her heart skipping a beat, her senses on high alert. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. She looked around, her eyes searching the darkness, trying to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from the wall behind her. She stood up, slowly, cautiously, approaching the wall, her hand reaching out to touch it. The stone was cold and damp, but there was something different. A crack, a fissure. She pressed her ear against the wall, listening intently. The scraping sound came again, even louder now, and she heard a faint whisper. A voice. Lady Beatrice? She gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that voice. It was familiar, but impossible. Who is it? She whispered, her voice trembling. It's me, the voice whispered back. Thomas, the messenger, the one who warned you. Beatrice's eyes widened in disbelief. Thomas? The man-at-arms who had served her father, who had warned her of Caradoc's plot. He was here? In the keep? Thomas? She whispered, her voice filled with hope, with disbelief. How is this possible? I followed you, Thomas whispered. I saw the knight. I knew he was not to be trusted. I found a way in.
Un secret passage. Un secret passage?
Beatrice repeated, her mind racing. Can you get me out? I'm trying, Thomas whispered. The wall is thick. But I have tools. I will break through. Just be patient. Beatrice leaned against the wall, her heart filled with a flicker of hope. A faint, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. She was not alone. She was not forgotten. There was a chance to escape, a chance to survive. She listened to the scraping sound, the scratching sound, the sounds of Thomas working, diligently, tirelessly, to free her. Each sound was a beacon of hope, a promise of salvation. She waited, her heart pounding, her breath held tight in her chest, her eyes fixed on the crack in the wall, waiting for the moment of her liberation, waiting for the dawn to break through the darkness. The crown of Blackmere, she realized, meant nothing if her soul, her heart, was forfeit. And right now, both were at the mercy of a ghost, a traitor and the man who claimed he was neither. Chapter 12. Threads of Treachery. The scraping continued, agonizingly slow, each minute stretching into an eternity. Beatrice pressed her ear against the wall, listening to Thomas's muffled grunts and the rhythmic chipping of stone. Her hope, fragile as it was, began to grow stronger, fueled by the sound of his efforts and the promise of escape. How did you know I was here? Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible, her throat dry and scratchy. I saw you, Thomas whispered back, his voice strained. I saw the knight bring you here. I followed him at a distance. I knew he was not to be trusted. I remembered the rumors. The stories. The stories? Beatrice repeated. What stories? The stories about his past, Thomas whispered. About his betrayal. About his madness. They said he was cursed. That he brought death to all who loved him. Beatrice's heart sank. The whispers again. The same whispers that had haunted her, that had warned her. But she had ignored them. She had trusted Geoffrey. She had loved him. I didn't believe them, Beatrice whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I thought he was different. I thought he had changed. He is a master of deception, Thomas whispered. He can fool anyone. He fooled me, too. Years ago. When I served him. Before the battle. You served him? Beatrice asked, her eyes widening in surprise. You were one of his men? Yes, Thomas whispered. I was a young squire, then. Eager to prove myself. Loyal to my knight. But I saw things. I heard things. Things that made me doubt him. Things that made me fear him. What things? Beatrice asked, her voice urgent.
Tell me.
There was a pause, a moment of silence, broken only by the scraping of stone. Beatrice held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for Thomas's answer. I saw him meeting with the enemy, Thomas whispered finally, his voice barely audible. Secret meetings. In the dead of night, I heard him talking, making deals. I saw letters. Letters with the enemy's seal. Beatrice gasped, her mind reeling from his words. This was proof. Proof of Geoffrey's treachery. Proof that he had betrayed the king. Proof that he had caused Alara's death. Did you tell anyone? Beatrice asked, her voice trembling. I tried, Thomas whispered. I told my captain.
But he didn't believe me.
He said I was mistaken. That Sir Geoffrey was a hero. That I was a traitor for even suggesting such a thing. So you did nothing? Beatrice asked, her voice filled with disappointment, with anger. I was afraid, Thomas whispered. I was young. I had no proof. Only my suspicions. And I knew what would happen if I spoke out. I would be branded a traitor. I would be executed. But after the battle, Beatrice said. After Geoffrey was declared a traitor. Why didn't you come forward then? I tried again, Thomas whispered. I went to the new king. I told him what I had seen, what I had heard. But he didn't believe me either. He said it was too late. That the matter was closed. That Geoffrey de Moray was dead. So you just gave up? Beatrice asked, her voice filled with frustration.
No, Thomas whispered.
I never gave up. I kept searching. For proof. For justice.
For Alara.
I knew she was innocent. I knew she deserved the truth. He paused, then added, and then I heard about your brother. About his death. About the rumors of treachery. I knew it was connected. I knew Jeffrey was involved. I had to warn you. I had to save you. Beatrice felt a surge of gratitude, of respect, for this man, this loyal soldier, who had risked his life to help her, to avenge her brother, to expose Jeffrey's treachery. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for believing in me. We're almost through, Thomas whispered, his voice strained. Just a little more. Beatrice held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the crack in the wall. The scraping sound grew louder, the crack wider. And then with a final, resounding crash, a section of the wall crumbled, revealing a dark opening. Thomas's face, covered in dust and grime, appeared in the opening, his eyes filled with relief, with triumph. Come, he said, his voice hoarse.
Quickly.
Before anyone hears. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She squeezed through the opening, into the secret passage, leaving behind the darkness of the dungeon, and stepping into the unknown. The threads of treachery were finally being pulled, but would they unravel the whole tapestry, or just ensnare Beatrice further? Chapter 13. A Falcon's Flight. The secret passage was narrow and damp, the air thick with a smell of dust and earth. Beatrice followed Thomas, her steps hurried and silent, her heart pounding in her chest. The passage twisted and turned, winding its way through the bowels of the keep, a labyrinth of hidden corridors and forgotten chambers. Where were we going? Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible. To the stables, Thomas whispered back. There's a hidden exit. It leads to the forest. But what about Jeffrey? Beatrice asked. He'll know we're gone. He'll come after us. I left a distraction, Thomas whispered. A false trail. It will buy us some time. A false trail? Beatrice repeated. What kind of false trail? I released some horses, Thomas whispered. Made it look like you escaped on horseback. They'll follow the tracks. They'll think you're heading south.
Towards Blackmere.
But that's where Caradoc is, Beatrice said. That's even more dangerous. It's a ruse, Thomas whispered. We won't go to Blackmere. We'll head north. To a place of safety. A place of safety? Beatrice repeated. Where? To the Abbey of St. Martha, Thomas whispered. It's a secluded place. Hidden in the mountains. No one will find us there. An abbey? Beatrice asked, her voice filled with surprise. But why an abbey? It's a place of sanctuary, Thomas whispered. The nuns are known for their discretion. They will shelter us. They will protect us. He paused, then added, and there is someone there who can help us. Someone who knows the truth about Jeffrey. Someone who can expose his lies. Who? Beatrice asked, her voice urgent. Who is the someone? The abbess, Thomas whispered. She was a close friend of Alara's. She knows everything. She has proof. Beatrice's heart leaped with hope. The abbess? Alara's friend? Proof of Jeffrey's treachery? This was a turning point. A chance to clear her name. A chance to avenge Alara. A chance to bring Jeffrey to justice. They continued their journey through the passage, their steps hurried and silent, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, leading them deeper and deeper into the bowels of the keep. Finally, they reached a small, wooden door, hidden behind a tapestry. Thomas carefully opened the door, revealing the stables. The stables were dark and empty, the horses gone, released by Thomas as part of his ruse. The air was cold and damp, but it was fresh, clean, a welcome change from the stifling air of the passage. Thomas led Beatrice to a small, hidden opening in the back wall of the stables, concealed behind a pile of straw. He pushed aside the straw, revealing a narrow tunnel, leading out of the keep. This is it, he said, his voice low. The exit. It leads to the forest. Beatrice looked at the tunnel, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. Her escape. Her chance for freedom. Her chance for justice. She took a deep breath, And then, without hesitation, she followed Thomas into the tunnel, leaving behind the darkness of the keep and stepping into the cold, crisp air of the night. The storm had passed, the snow had stopped, and the moon, full and bright, illuminated the landscape, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow-covered ground. They emerged from the tunnel into a dense forest, the trees towering above them, their branches laden with snow. The air was still and silent, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the fresh snow. Thomas led Beatrice through the forest, his steps swift and sure, his knowledge of the terrain evident. He knew exactly where he was going. They walked for hours, their bodies aching, their feet numb with cold, but their spirits buoyed by the hope of reaching the abbey, of finding sanctuary, of exposing Geoffrey's treachery. As they walked, Beatrice couldn't help but think of Geoffrey, of his betrayal, of his lies, of his cruelty. She remembered his touch, his kiss, his promises. It had all been a lie, a cruel, elaborate deception. She felt a mixture of emotions. Anger, hatred, betrayal, but also sadness. Sadness for the man she had thought she knew, the man she had loved. Sadness for the life he had lost, the life he had thrown away. She looked up at the moon, full and bright, casting its silvery light on the snow-covered landscape. It was a beautiful night, a night filled with magic, with mystery, with a strange, unsettling peace. As they continued north, Beatrice asked but Morwen. She said she raised Geoffrey. What did she mean? Thomas glanced at her, his eyes filled with a haunted look.
She
was his nursemaid. But more than that, a sorceress, some say. She filled his head with dark tales, twisted his mind.
She
is the source of the whispers, my lady, and a danger in her own right. The truth, it seemed, was as twisted and perilous as their path through the night. As they crested a small rise, Beatrice saw it in the distance. A faint, flickering light, nestled among the dark peaks of the mountains. The abbey, Thomas whispered, his voice filled with relief. We're almost there. And with this sign, the falcon had finally taken flight from its cage. Chapter 14. The Heart of the Storm. The Abbey of St. Martha was a haven of peace, a sanctuary of stone and silence nestled high in the snow-capped mountains. Its walls were thick and strong, its gates were tall and imposing, and its chapel, with its soaring arches and stained glass windows, was a testament to faith and devotion. As Beatrice and Thomas approached the abbey gates, a lone figure, cloaked and hooded, emerged from the shadows. It was a nun, her face pale and serene, her eyes filled with a gentle wisdom. Welcome, travelers, she said, her voice soft and melodious. You seek shelter? You seek sanctuary? Yes, sister, Thomas replied, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. We have traveled far. We are in need of your help. The nun studied them for a moment. Her eyes, though gentle, seemed to pierce through their disguises, to see the truth that lay hidden beneath.
You're troubled, she said.
You are pursued. You carry a heavy burden. We do, Beatrice said, her voice trembling. We have a story to tell. A story of treachery. A story of betrayal. A story of a knight who has lost his way. The nun nodded slowly. Come, she said. The abbess awaits you. She will listen to your story. She will offer you guidance. She will help you find peace. She led them through the gates, into the courtyard of the abbey, where the silence was broken only by the gentle murmur of prayers and the soft flutter of doves. They were taken to a small, sparsely furnished chamber, where a fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow. The nun offered them food and drink, simple fare, but nourishing and welcome after their long, arduous journey. As they ate, Beatrice felt a sense of calm, of safety, wash over her. It was as if the walls of the abbey itself radiated a sense of peace, of protection, a shield against the dangers of the outside world. After they had eaten, the nun led them to the abbess's chamber, a larger room, but still simple and unadorned. The abbess, an elderly woman with a face etched with wisdom and compassion, sat in a high-backed chair, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Welcome, my children," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I am Abbess Eleanor. I understand you have a story to tell." Beatrice and Thomas knelt before her, their heads bowed, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Yes, Abbess," Beatrice said, her voice trembling. We do." And so, they began to tell their story, starting with Alaric's death, Beatrice's flight, her encounter with Geoffrey, his confession, his betrayal, and their escape from Blackwood Keep. They told her everything, leaving out nothing, revealing every detail, every secret, every lie. The abbess listened patiently, her eyes never leaving their faces, her expression unchanging, her silence both comforting and unsettling. When they had finished, she sat for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point, lost in thought. Then, she looked at them, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "This is a tragic tale," she said, her voice low and sorrowful. "A tale of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of a knight who has fallen from grace." He is evil, Abbess," Beatrice said, her voice filled with anger, with hatred. "He is a monster. He must be stopped." The abbess nodded slowly. "He has done terrible things," she said. "He has caused great suffering. He has broken many hearts. But he is not beyond redemption, my child. There is still good in him. Buried deep, perhaps, but it is there." I don't believe it," Beatrice said, her voice shaking. "I saw his true face. I heard his true voice. He is evil. He is lost," the abbess said. "He is trapped in a web of his own making. A web of lies, of deceit, of darkness. But he can be freed. He can be redeemed. If he chooses to be." "But how?" Beatrice asked, her voice filled with doubt, with despair. "How can he possibly be redeemed?" The abbess smiled, a faint, gentle smile that lit up her face. "Through love, my child," she said. "Through forgiveness. Through the power of truth." She paused, then added, "and through the evidence. The proof of his treachery. The proof that will clear your name. The proof that will bring him to justice." "You said you had proof," Beatrice said, her voice filled with hope, with anticipation. "You said you knew the truth." The abbess nodded. "I do," she said. "Alara was my dearest friend. She confided in me. She shared her secrets. She entrusted me with her most precious possessions." She stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked over to a small, wooden chest that stood in the corner of the room. She opened it and removed a collection of objects. Beatrice gasped, her heart skipping a beat. The objects were familiar. A silver locket, intricately carved with the image of a falcon. A faded, silk scarf, embroidered with the same falcon crest. A collection of letters, tied together with a ribbon. These are Alara's," Beatrice whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes," the abbess said. "And they tell a different story. A story of loyalty. A story of love. A story of a knight who was betrayed, not a betrayer." She handed Beatrice the letters. "Read them," she said. "Read them, and you will understand." Beatrice took the letters, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. It was Alara's handwriting, elegant and graceful, filled with love, with devotion, with unwavering faith in Geoffrey. She began to read, and as she read, the truth began to unfold. A truth that was both shocking and heartbreaking. A truth that changed everything. The heart of the storm, she found, wasn't about wind or snow, but the tempest within a human soul. Chapter 15. Flames of Rebellion. Alara's letters painted a picture vastly different from the one Geoffrey had presented. They spoke of a man deeply in love, fiercely loyal to his king, and increasingly suspicious of the court's inner circle. She wrote of his growing unease, his fears of a conspiracy, and his determination to uncover the truth, even at great personal risk. One letter, dated just weeks before the Battle of Blackwood Moor, was particularly revealing. "My dearest Geoffrey," Alara wrote, "your words trouble me greatly. This Lord Caradoc, you believe he is the traitor? That he is plotting with Northumbria? It seems impossible, and yet I trust your instincts. You must be careful, my love. These are dangerous times, and treachery lurks in every shadow. I fear for you, Geoffrey. I fear for us. But know this, my heart, I believe in you. I love you, and I will wait for you, forever if need be." Another letter, written just days before the battle, contained a chilling passage. "Geoffrey, my love," Alara wrote, "I have learned something terrible. Something that confirms your suspicions. Caradoc, he is indeed the traitor. He has been communicating with Northumbria. He has promised them victory in exchange for power. He plans to betray the king, to deliver our forces into the enemy's hands. I have proof. A letter, intercepted from one of his messengers. I have hidden it safely, where only you will find it, in the falcon's nest." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The falcon's nest? What did it mean? Where was it? The abbess, who had been watching Beatrice intently, spoke softly. "The falcon's nest," she said, "was a secret place. A place where Geoffrey and Alara would meet. A place where they shared their hopes and dreams. A place where they hid their treasures. But where is it?" Beatrice asked, her voice urgent. "Where is this falcon's nest?" "It is at Blackmere," the abbess said. "In the old falconry tower. On the west wall of the castle. There is a loose stone. Behind it you will find the letter." Beatrice's mind raced. Blackmere. She had to get to Blackmere. She had to find the letter. She had to expose Caradoc. She had to clear Geoffrey's name. But how? Blackmere was under Caradoc's control. It was a fortress. Impenetrable. I have to go back," Beatrice said, her voice filled with determination. "I have to find the letter." "It is too dangerous, my child," the abbess said. "Caradoc is ruthless. He will not hesitate to kill you." "I know," Beatrice said. "But I have no choice. I have to try. For Alara. For Geoffrey. For justice." Thomas, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I will go with you, my lady," he said. "I will protect you. I will help you find the letter." Beatrice looked at him, her heart filled with gratitude, with respect. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "But it's too dangerous. I can't ask you to risk your life." "My life is yours to command, my lady," Thomas said. I swore an oath. To serve you. To protect you. And I will not break that oath." Beatrice nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She had a loyal friend. A true ally. She was not alone. "We will need a plan," she said. "A way to get into Blackmere. Unseen. Unheard." The abbess smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "There is a way," she said. "A secret passage. Known only to a few. It leads from the forest into the heart of the castle." "A secret passage?" Beatrice repeated, her eyes widening in hope. "Like the one at Blackwood Keep?" "Yes," the abbess said. "But this one is older. More dangerous. It has not been used in many years. It is said to be guarded." "Guarded?" Beatrice asked, her voice filled with apprehension. "By what?" The abbess hesitated, her eyes filled with a strange light. "By the spirits of the past," she said. "By the ghosts of those who died within its walls. By the whispers of treachery and betrayal." Beatrice shivered, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers again. They seemed to follow her, to haunt her, to warn her. I am not afraid," she said, her voice trembling, but firm. "I will face the whispers. I will face the ghosts. I will find the letter." The abbess nodded. "Then may the light guide you, my child," she said. "May the truth prevail. And may love conquer all." She gave them directions to the secret passage, a map drawn on a piece of parchment, and a blessing. Beatrice and Thomas, armed with their courage, their determination, and the hope of finding the truth, prepared to embark on their perilous journey. Back to Blackmere. Back to the heart of the storm. As they left the sanctuary of the abbey, Beatrice felt a renewed sense of purpose. But she also knew this. Caradoc would not give up power easily, and Geoffrey, wherever he was, and whatever his true motives, was a wild card. A rebellion was brewing, and she was holding the match. Chapter 16. A Kingdom's Ransom. The journey back to Blackmere was fraught with peril. Beatrice and Thomas traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding roads and settlements, sticking to the dense forest and treacherous mountain paths. They moved with stealth and caution, aware that Caradoc's spies could be anywhere, watching, waiting. The secret passage, as the abbess had warned, was old and dangerous. It was narrow and winding, filled with crumbling stone, treacherous drops, and the unsettling whispers of the past. Beatrice, despite her fear, pressed on, driven by the hope of finding Alara's letter and exposing Caradoc's treachery. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the end of the passage, emerging into a small, hidden chamber within the walls of Blackmere. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, and the silence was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water. "We're inside," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "But we need to be careful. Caradoc's guards are everywhere." Beatrice nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the presence of the castle around her, the weight of its history, the darkness of its secrets. They moved slowly, cautiously, through the hidden corridors and forgotten chambers of Blackmere, their steps silent, their senses on high alert. They avoided the main halls and populated areas, sticking to the shadows, listening for any sign of danger. The Falconry Tower, their destination, was located on the west wall of the castle, a tall, imposing structure that had once housed the royal falcons, but had long since fallen into disuse. As they approached the tower, Beatrice felt a growing unease. The air seemed colder here, the silence deeper, the shadows more menacing. She could hear the faint whispers, growing louder, closer, as if warning her, urging her to turn back. But she pressed on, her determination unwavering. She had come too far, risked too much, to give up now. She had to find the letter. She had to expose Caradoc. She had to clear Geoffrey's name, even if he didn't deserve it. They reached the tower, its entrance a dark, gaping maw, leading into the unknown. Thomas drew his sword, his face grim, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Stay close, my lady," he said, his voice low. "And be ready for anything." Beatrice nodded, her hand on the hilt of her dagger, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, and then, together, they stepped into the darkness. The interior of the tower was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of decay, and something unsettling. The only light came from a few narrow slits in the wall, high above, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed around them. They climbed the winding staircase, their steps slow and cautious, their ears straining for any sound, their eyes searching the darkness. The whispers grew louder, closer, swirling around them, whispering secrets, whispering warnings, whispering threats. They reached the top of the tower, a circular chamber, its walls lined with empty perches, its floor covered in dust and debris. The air was heavy here, the silence oppressive, the sense of unease overwhelming. Beatrice looked around, her eyes searching for the loose stone, the falcon's nest, the hiding place of Alara's letter. "There," Thomas said, pointing to a section of the wall, near a narrow window. "I see it. A loose stone." Beatrice followed his gaze and saw it. A single stone, slightly dislodged from the surrounding wall, barely noticeable, but there. She approached the stone, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling. She reached out, and with a gentle push, she dislodged the stone, revealing a small, dark cavity behind it. The falcon's nest. She reached into the cavity, her fingers brushing against something. Something small and wrapped in cloth. She pulled it out, her heart leaping with anticipation. It was a small, leather pouch, tied with a ribbon. She untied the ribbon and opened the pouch. Inside, she found a single, folded letter. Alara's letter. The proof. The key to everything. She unfolded the letter, her hands shaking, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was as Alara had written. A confession of Caradoc's treachery, his plot with Northumbria, his betrayal of the king. Beatrice felt a surge of triumph, of relief, of vindication. She had found it. She had the proof. She could expose Caradoc. She could clear Geoffrey's name. She could bring justice to Blackmere. But her triumph was short-lived. As she held the letter, a voice, cold and cruel, echoed through the chamber. "Looking for something, my lady?" Beatrice gasped, her head snapping up, her eyes widening in terror. Standing in the doorway, blocking their escape, was Caradoc. He was flanked by 2 guards, their swords drawn, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a menacing light. How did you know?" Beatrice stammered, her voice trembling. Caradoc smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I have eyes everywhere, my lady," he said. "Ears everywhere. Nothing escapes my notice." You killed my brother," Beatrice said, her voice filled with anger, with hatred. "You betrayed the king. You deserve to die." Caradoc laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Perhaps," he said. "But I am not the one who will die today. You are." He gestured to his guards, and they advanced, their swords raised, ready to strike. Beatrice and Thomas stood back to back, their weapons drawn, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were outnumbered, outmatched, trapped. But they would not surrender. They would fight, to the death. The chamber erupted in a flurry of steel, the clang of swords echoing through the tower, the whispers of the past rising to a crescendo, as if cheering on the deadly dance. Beatrice had secured the letter, the kingdom's ransom, but now, the price was her own life. Chapter 17. Echoes of Lost Love. The clash of steel echoed through the falconry tower, a brutal symphony of desperation and defiance. Beatrice, though no seasoned warrior, fought with the ferocity of a cornered lioness, her small dagger a blur of motion as she parried and thrust, narrowly avoiding the guards' deadly blades. Thomas, a veteran soldier, fought with grim determination, his sword a whirlwind of steel, protecting Beatrice's back while engaging Caradoc's men. Caradoc watched the struggle with a cold, detached amusement, his arms crossed, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was confident in his victory. His men were stronger, more experienced, and they outnumbered their opponents. Despite their courage and skill, Beatrice and Thomas were slowly being overwhelmed. The guards pressed their attack, forcing them back, step by step, towards the narrow window, towards the sheer drop below. "You cannot win, my lady," Caradoc said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Surrender, and I might show you mercy." "Never," Beatrice retorted, her voice filled with defiance, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I will never surrender to a traitor." She lunged, her dagger aimed for one of the guards, but he sidestepped the blow, and with a swift, brutal movement, he disarmed her, sending her dagger clattering across the stone floor. Beatrice stood, defenseless, her back against the wall, the guard's sword pointed at her throat. She was trapped, defeated. Thomas, seeing Beatrice's plight, roared in anger and redoubled his efforts, fighting with a renewed ferocity, trying to reach her, to protect her. But the other guard blocked his path, their swords clashing with a deafening clang. Caradoc stepped forward, his smile widening, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "It is over, my lady," he said. "Your little rebellion has failed." He reached out, his hand grasping Alara's letter, still clutched in Beatrice's hand. He ripped it from her grasp, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a shiver of revulsion through her. "This evidence," he said, his voice mocking, "means nothing. It will disappear. Just like you." He raised his hand, signaling to the guard, and the guard raised his sword, ready to deliver the final blow. Beatrice closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She had failed. Failed to expose Caradoc. Failed to clear Geoffrey's name. Failed to avenge her brother. Failed to save herself. But the blow never came. Instead, she heard a roar, a cry of rage, and the clang of steel, followed by a sickening thud. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind struggling to comprehend what had happened. The guard who had been about to kill her was lying on the floor, his body lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Standing over him, his sword dripping with blood, was Geoffrey. He was different. His face was no longer masked by deception, by lies. His eyes, though still intense, were filled with a raw, untamed fury, a burning fire that consumed all traces of his former coldness. He looked at Beatrice, his gaze fierce, protective, and something that sent a shiver down her spine. "I told you," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "that I would not betray you." Caradoc stared at Geoffrey, his eyes widening in shock, in disbelief, in fear. "You?" he stammered. "But you're dead. You're supposed to be dead." Geoffrey smiled, a cold, ruthless smile that revealed a glimpse of the Lion of Blackwood, the legendary warrior he had once been. "Rumors of my demise," he said, his voice dripping with irony, "have been greatly exaggerated." He turned his attention to the remaining guard, who stood frozen in fear, his sword trembling in his hand. "Drop your weapon," Geoffrey commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. The guard, without hesitation, obeyed, his sword clattering to the floor. Geoffrey advanced on Caradoc, his sword raised, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You framed me. You caused Alara's death. You deserve to die." Caradoc backed away, his face pale with terror, his hands raised in a futile gesture of defense. "No," he stammered. "Please, I can explain." There is nothing to explain," Geoffrey said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Your treachery is clear. Your guilt is undeniable. Your time is up." He lunged, his sword flashing, aiming for Caradoc's heart. But Caradoc, with a desperate cry, dodged the blow and scrambled to his feet, fleeing towards the doorway, towards the stairs, towards escape. Geoffrey pursued him, his movements swift and relentless, his sword a blur of motion, his eyes fixed on his prey. Beatrice, still reeling from the shock of Geoffrey's arrival, watched the chase, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind filled with a mixture of relief, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Geoffrey had saved her. He had fought for her. He had vowed not to betray her. But he had lied to her before. He had manipulated her. He had used her. Could she trust him now? Could she believe anything he said? She looked at Thomas, who stood beside her, his sword still drawn, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and suspicion. What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. We wait," Thomas said, his voice low. We see what happens. We see if he truly is on our side." They waited, their hearts pounding, their breaths held tight in their chests, listening to the sounds of the chase, the clang of steel, the cries of rage, echoing through the tower. And then silence. A heavy, profound silence, broken only by the faint whispers of the past. Beatrice and Thomas exchanged a look, their eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and hope. They moved slowly, cautiously, towards the doorway, towards the stairs, towards the source of the silence. They descended the stairs, their steps slow and deliberate, their ears straining for any sound, their eyes searching the darkness. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and there, in the entrance hall of the tower, they saw him. Geoffrey. He was standing over Caradoc's lifeless body, his sword dripping with blood, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. He looked at Beatrice, his gaze intense, searching, and something that made her heart ache. "It is done," he said, his voice low and weary.
"He is dead.
The traitor is no more." He paused, then added, "And Alara is avenged." The echoes of lost love, it seemed, had finally found their target. But the battle, Beatrice knew, was far from over. Chapter 18. The Unveiling. The silence that followed Geoffrey's words was heavy, laden with the weight of the events that had just transpired. Beatrice stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart torn between relief, gratitude, and a lingering, persistent doubt. Caradoc was dead, justice had been served, but the truth about Geoffrey remained shrouded in a mist of conflicting emotions and unanswered questions. What now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the cold, calculating cruelty she had witnessed in the dungeon. Geoffrey sheathed his sword, the metallic scrape echoing through the hall. He walked towards her, slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough for her to see the exhaustion etched on his face, the faint tremor in his hands, the sorrow that still lingered in his eyes. Now, he said, his voice low and weary, we rebuild. We restore. We reclaim what was lost.
But how?
Beatrice asked. Blackmere is in chaos. Your name is still cursed. The people, they will not trust you. He nodded slowly. I know, he said. It will not be easy. But it is possible. With your help. My help? Beatrice repeated, her eyes widening in surprise. But I am no one. I have no power. No influence. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that softened his features, reminding her of the man she had thought she knew, the man she had fallen in love with. You are Lady Beatrice of Blackmere, he said. You are Alaric's sister. You are the rightful heir. You have the loyalty of many. And you have the truth. He reached into his tunic and pulled out Alara's letter, the letter Caradoc had tried to destroy. He handed it to her. This, he said, is your weapon. This is your shield. This is your key to Blackmere's future. And to mine. Beatrice took the letter, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at it, at Alara's familiar handwriting, at the words that held the power to change everything. But what about you? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. What about the accusations? The whispers? The lies? He took a deep breath, and then he began to speak. He told her the whole story, the true story, from beginning to end. He told her how he had suspected Caradoc, how he had gathered evidence, how he had planned to expose him, but had been betrayed, framed, forced to flee for his life. He told her how he had lived in hiding for years, watching, waiting, planning his revenge, his return. He told her how he had learned of Alaric's death, of Beatrice's flight, of Caradoc's seizure of power. He had known then that he had to act, that he had to protect her, that he had to reclaim his name, his honor, his legacy. He told her how he had used her, yes, but not as a pawn, not as a means to an end, but as a catalyst, as a spark, as a way to ignite the flames of rebellion, to expose Caradoc's treachery, to bring him to justice. He told her how he had planned the encounter in the dungeon, how he had manipulated Morwen, how he had staged his betrayal, to test her, to see if she was strong enough, to see if she was worthy of his trust, of his love. I had to be sure, he said, his voice filled with regret, with apology. I had to know that you would not break, that you would not betray me, that you would fight for the truth, even if it meant facing your own death. Beatrice stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart aching. It was a twisted, cruel plan, a dangerous gamble, but it had worked. It had exposed Caradoc. It had saved her life. It had cleared his name. But Morwen, she said, her voice trembling. What about her? She said, she raised you. She said you were a monster. Geoffrey nodded slowly. Morwen, he said, was my nursemaid. She filled my head with stories, with lies, with darkness. She resented my father. She hated Alara. She wanted me to embrace the shadows, to become a tyrant, to rule through fear. She was Caradoc's informant,
His spy,
his tool. And you let her believe you were one of them, Beatrice said, her voice filled with understanding, with awe. Yes, Geoffrey said. I played the part. I deceived her. I used her own darkness against her. It was the only way to get close to Caradoc, to learn his plans, to prepare for my return. He paused, then added, but it took a toll. It darkened my soul. It made me question myself. It made me fear that I was becoming the monster she wanted me to be. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a vulnerability, a raw honesty that she had never seen before. I am not a monster, Beatrice, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I am a man. A flawed man. A man who has made mistakes. A man who has done terrible things. But I am not evil. And I am not your enemy. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a shiver through her. I love you, Beatrice, he said, his voice filled with emotion, with tenderness, with a desperate plea for forgiveness. I have loved you from the moment I saw you, standing in that storm-swept courtyard, your eyes filled with fear and defiance. I know I don't deserve you. I know I have hurt you. But please believe me. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you.
If you will let me.
Beatrice looked at him, her heart overflowing with a mixture of emotions. Love, forgiveness, hope, and a lingering, persistent fear. Could she trust him? Could she forgive him? Could she love him again?
She didn't know.
She needed time. Time to heal. Time to understand. Time to decide. But she knew one thing. She knew that she was not alone. She had Thomas. She had the Abbess. She had the people of Blackmere. And she had Geoffrey. A flawed, broken, but ultimately redeemed man. A man who had fought for her, who had saved her, who had loved her. She reached out, her hand taking his, her fingers intertwining with his, their touch sending a spark of hope, of possibility, of a future that was uncertain, but no longer bleak. We will see, she said, her voice soft but firm. We will see what the future holds. We will rebuild. We will restore. We will reclaim Blackmere. Together. The unveiling was complete. The truth was out. But the path ahead was long, and only time would tell if love and trust could truly blossom from the ashes of betrayal. Chapter 19. Between Two Kingdoms. The return to Blackmere was a somber procession. Caradoc's body, wrapped in a simple shroud, was carried on a makeshift litter by two of Geoffrey's men who had remained loyal to him, hidden in the surrounding villages, waiting for his return. Beatrice rode Willow, her head held high, her expression resolute, but her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. Thomas rode beside her, his presence a constant reassurance, his loyalty a steadfast anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. The news of Caradoc's death and Geoffrey's return had spread like wildfire, carried on the wind, whispered in hushed tones from village to village, from farm to farm, reaching the gates of Blackmere before they did. As they approached the castle, the gates swung open, not in defiance, but in cautious welcome. The people of Blackmere, the castle guards, the servants, the villagers, lined the road, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a flicker of hope. They had heard the rumors, the whispers, the conflicting stories. They had seen Caradoc's tyranny, his cruelty, his oppression. They had longed for a return to justice, to peace, to the rule of their rightful lord. But they were wary. They were uncertain. They had been betrayed before. They had learned to distrust. Beatrice, sensing their apprehension, raised her hand, a gesture of peace, of reassurance. People of Blackmere, she called out, her voice strong and clear, echoing through the courtyard. I am Beatrice, sister of Alaric, your rightful lord. I have returned to reclaim my birthright, to restore justice, to bring peace to our land. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, her eyes meeting theirs, connecting with their fear, their hope, their longing. Caradoc, she continued, her voice filled with sorrow, with anger, was a traitor. He murdered my brother. He betrayed the king. He ruled through fear and oppression. He is dead. His reign of terror is over. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of relief, of disbelief, of cautious optimism. But Beatrice continued, her voice firm and resolute. There is another story. A story of another betrayal. A story of a knight who was falsely accused, a knight who was framed, a knight who was forced to flee for his life. A knight who has now returned to reclaim his name, his honor, his legacy. She gestured towards Geoffrey, who stood beside her, his head bowed, his expression somber, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and trepidation. "This," she said, her voice filled with emotion, with a growing conviction, "is Sir Geoffrey de Moray, the Lion of Blackwood. He is not a traitor. He is a hero. He is the rightful lord of these lands. And he has returned to serve you, to protect you, to lead you to a better future." The crowd was silent, stunned, their eyes fixed on Geoffrey, their minds struggling to reconcile the legend with the reality, the rumors with the truth. Geoffrey stepped forward, his head raised, his eyes meeting theirs, his voice strong and clear, echoing through the courtyard. "People of Blackmere," he said, "I know I have been gone for many years. I know you have heard stories, rumors, lies. I know you have reason to distrust me. But I swear to you, on my honor, on my life, on the memory of Alara, that I am not a traitor. I was framed, I was betrayed, and I have returned to prove my innocence, to reclaim my name, to serve you, to protect you, to lead you to a better future." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, his eyes searching for acceptance, for forgiveness, for trust. "I do not ask for your blind faith," he said. "I ask for a chance to prove myself, a chance to earn your trust, a chance to rebuild Blackmere, to restore its glory, to bring peace and prosperity to our land." He extended his hand, a gesture of peace, of reconciliation, of hope. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, the fate of Blackmere, the future of two kingdoms, hanging in the balance. Then, slowly, hesitantly, a single voice broke the silence. I believe you," an old woman said, her voice trembling, but firm. She was a servant, a cook, who had served in the castle for many years. I remember you," she continued. "I remember your kindness. I remember your loyalty. I remember Alara. I never believed the lies. I always knew you were innocent." Her words sparked a chain reaction. One by one, others stepped forward, voicing their support, their belief, their hope. I believe you too," a young guard said. "My father served under you. He always spoke of your courage, your honor, your justice." "And I," a farmer said, "I remember your father. He was a good man, a just man. I believe you are like him." The murmur grew, swelling into a chorus of voices, a wave of acceptance, of forgiveness, of trust. Beatrice felt a surge of relief, of gratitude, of hope. The people of Blackmere had chosen to believe. They had chosen to forgive. They had chosen to trust. Geoffrey lowered his hand, his eyes filled with tears, his face radiant with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for giving me a second chance. I will not disappoint you. I swear it." But the celebrations were short-lived. As cheers began to rise, a horn blew, long and loud, from the south gate. A rider approached, galloping hard, bearing a banner, a crimson dragon on a field of black. "Northumbria." The rider skidded to a halt before Geoffrey and Beatrice, his face grim. "My lords," he said, breathless, "the Duke of Northumbria amasses his forces. He claims Blackmere, by right of conquest, and by right of marriage." "Marriage?" Geoffrey and Beatrice asked in unison. The messenger swallowed hard. "He claims Lady Beatrice as his bride, promised to him by Lord Caradoc. Between two kingdoms, war and love, Beatrice stood at the very center, with no clear path and no easy choices." Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The messenger's words hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement that shattered the fragile peace that had begun to settle over Blackmere. The Duke of Northumbria, the very man Geoffrey had supposedly betrayed, now claimed Beatrice as his bride, a prize of war, a tool to solidify his conquest. Beatrice felt a surge of fury, of revulsion, of defiance. She would not be a pawn. She would not be traded like property. She would not marry the enemy of her people, the man who had indirectly caused her brother's death, the man who represented everything she despised. He has no claim, she said, her voice trembling with anger, her hands clenched into fists. "I will never marry him. I would rather die." Geoffrey placed a reassuring hand on her arm, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her, a reminder of his presence, of his support, of the complex emotions that still bound them together. He will not have you, Beatrice," he said, his voice firm and resolute, his eyes burning with a fierce protectiveness. I will not allow it. I will fight him. I will defend you. I will protect Blackmere, even if it costs me my life." He turned to the messenger, his expression grim, his voice filled with a steely determination. "Tell your duke," he said, "that Lady Beatrice is under my protection. Tell him that Blackmere will not surrender. Tell him that if he wants war, he will have it. And tell him that the Lion of Blackwood has returned." The messenger, his face pale with apprehension, bowed his head. "As you command, my lord," he said, his voice trembling. He turned his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the distance, carrying Geoffrey's defiant message back to Northumbria. The people of Blackmere, who had witnessed the exchange, erupted in a roar of approval, of support, of defiance. They had chosen their leader. They had chosen their path. They would fight. They would defend their land. They would defend their lady. Geoffrey turned to Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. We must prepare," he said. We must gather our forces. We must fortify the castle. We must be ready for war." Beatrice nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing, trying to grasp the enormity of the situation. It was a terrifying prospect, a brutal reality, but she knew it was inevitable. She had a duty to her people, a duty to her brother, a duty to Blackmere. I will help," she said, her voice firm and resolute. I will do whatever I can. I will not be a burden. I will fight alongside you." Geoffrey smiled, a faint, tender smile that softened his features, reminding her of the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had betrayed her, the man who had saved her, the man who now stood beside her, ready to face the storm together. I know you will, Beatrice," he said, his voice filled with admiration, with respect, with a growing love that transcended the chaos and uncertainty that surrounded them. They spent the next few days preparing for war. Geoffrey, with his military experience, took charge of the defenses, organizing the guards, training the villagers, repairing the walls, strengthening the gates, preparing for the inevitable siege. Beatrice, with her knowledge of the castle, of its secrets, of its people, worked alongside him, rallying support, organizing supplies, tending to the wounded, offering comfort and hope to those who feared the coming storm. They worked tirelessly, side by side, their individual strengths complementing each other, their shared purpose uniting them, their complex emotions slowly, tentatively, weaving a tapestry of trust, of respect, of a love that was both fragile and enduring. As they prepared for war, Beatrice found herself drawn to Geoffrey, despite her lingering doubts, despite her past hurts, despite the uncertainty of the future. She saw his strength, his courage, his determination, but she also saw his vulnerability, his regret, his unwavering commitment to her, to Blackmere, to justice. She saw the man he truly was, beneath the scars, beneath the lies, beneath the legend. A man who had made mistakes, a man who had suffered, a man who was striving to redeem himself, to become worthy of her love, of her trust, of her forgiveness. And slowly, tentatively, she began to forgive him. She began to trust him. She began to love him again. Not blindly, not naively, but with a clear-eyed understanding of his flaws, of his strengths, of the complex, imperfect, but ultimately good man that he was. The day of the battle arrived, a cold, gray dawn, the sky heavy with a threat of snow, the air thick with tension, with fear, with anticipation. The Northumbrian army, a vast, formidable force, stood before the gates of Blackmere, their banners bearing the crimson dragon, their weapons gleaming in the pale light, their numbers overwhelming. Geoffrey, clad in his ancestral armor, the Lion of Blackwood emblazoned on his chest, stood on the battlements, his sword drawn, his face grim, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. Beatrice, dressed in a simple tunic and breeches, her hair braided, her hand on the hilt of a borrowed sword, stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. They looked at each other, their eyes meeting, their gazes locking, a silent exchange of love, of trust, of a shared commitment to face the storm together, to fight for their future, to fight for Blackmere.
The battle began.
The reckoning had come. Love and duty were intertwined, and only the outcome of this battle would determine if their future held triumph or tragedy. Epilogue. The battle for Blackmere raged for hours, a brutal, bloody clash of steel and will. Geoffrey, the Lion of Blackwood reborn, fought with a ferocity and skill that inspired his men and struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. He moved through the fray like a whirlwind of death, his sword a blur of motion, cutting down Northumbrian soldiers left and right, his presence a beacon of hope and defiance. Beatrice, though not a trained warrior, fought with courage and determination, defending the castle walls alongside the men-at-arms, her small sword proving surprisingly effective against the invaders. She moved with a grace and agility that belied her noble upbringing, her spirit unbroken, her resolve unwavering. Thomas, ever loyal, fought at Beatrice's side, his sword a shield protecting her from harm, his presence a constant reassurance. The battle seesawed back and forth, victory seeming to slip from one side's grasp to the other's. The walls of Blackmere were breached, the courtyard became a killing field, and the air was thick with the cries of the wounded and the dying. But the defenders of Blackmere, inspired by Geoffrey's leadership and Beatrice's courage, fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. They had something to fight for, their homes, their families, their freedom, their future. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the tide began to turn. The Northumbrian forces, exhausted and demoralized by the fierce resistance, began to waver. Their attack lost its momentum, their ranks thinned, their morale crumbled. Geoffrey, sensing the shift, seized the opportunity. He rallied his men, and with a final, desperate charge, they broke through the enemy lines, driving them back, forcing them to retreat. The Duke of Northumbria, seeing his army routed, his ambitions shattered, his hopes of conquest dashed, turned his horse and fled, disappearing into the gathering dusk, leaving his dead and wounded behind. The battle was over. Blackmere had won. The cheers of the victors echoed through the castle, a triumphant cry of relief, of jubilation, of freedom. Beatrice, exhausted but exhilarated, her face smeared with dirt and blood, her clothes torn and stained, stood on the battlements, beside Geoffrey, their hands clasped, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a deep, abiding love. They had faced the storm together. They had fought for their future. They had won. The years that followed were a time of rebuilding, of healing, of restoration. Geoffrey, his name cleared, his honor restored, ruled Blackmere with wisdom and justice, guided by Beatrice's counsel, supported by Thomas's loyalty, loved by the people he had sworn to protect. Blackmere prospered. Its fields yielded bountiful harvests, its trade flourished, its people lived in peace and security. The scars of war slowly faded, replaced by a renewed sense of hope, of community, of a future that was bright and promising. Geoffrey and Beatrice married, their union a symbol of the reconciliation between two kingdoms, a testament to the power of love to overcome hatred, to heal wounds, to forge a new beginning. They had children, sons and daughters who inherited their parents' courage, their wisdom, their unwavering commitment to justice and peace. The whispers of the past, the ghosts of treachery and betrayal, slowly faded, replaced by the laughter of children, the songs of birds, the gentle murmur of a land at peace. Morwen, captured during the battle, was banished, her dark magic rendered powerless by the strength of Geoffrey and Beatrice's love, by the unity of the people of Blackmere. And so, the story of the Winter Lord's secret came to an end. A story of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of a knight who had lost his way and a lady who had helped him find it again. A story of a kingdom saved, a future secured, a love that had conquered all. They stood together often, on clear nights, upon the very same battlements where they'd faced seemingly insurmountable odds. The stars, much like their interwoven destinies, glimmered. They had weathered deceit, conspiracies, and even the cold, calculating ambition that once threatened to consume them. Beatrice, remembering the fear, the uncertainty, often found herself reaching for Geoffrey's hand. A simple touch, a silent reassurance of all they'd overcome. He'd squeeze gently, a wordless promise of forever. "The whispers are quiet now," she said one evening, her voice soft against the backdrop of the peaceful kingdom. Geoffrey, his arm around her waist, nodded, his gaze sweeping across their lands. "They are. The stones remember, but they no longer accuse." Beatrice leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "We gave them new stories to tell." And indeed, they had. Stories of courage, of forgiveness, of rebuilding, and above all, stories of a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of betrayal, a love that had proven stronger than any sword, any army, any whisper of the past. Blackmere was safe. Their hearts,